My goodness. Well, look at everybody. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. I am currently in Brisbane, Australia, and today's webinar will be on radiation risk explained. My name is Julie Sullivan. I am a member of the IOHA Education and Training Committee, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator for today's session. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. The webinar is recorded. Your cameras and microphones will remain off for the duration. Oh, sorry, just got a little glitch here. Sorry. Anyway, we'll have questions and answers at the end of the discussion, so I hope you all join us. We are joined today also by our current president and our president-elect. Matthew and Carrie, would you like to say a quick hello?
Hi, everyone.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Welcome to this morning's webinar. It's going to be, like I said in my post yesterday, had a sneak preview of Cameron's presentation yesterday, and it looks like to be a good one. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Carrie. How about you, Matthew?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Thanks, everyone, for joining. And I know it's going to be a great session. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. So before we get started, a few more words about the IOHA. The International Occupational Hygiene Association brings together 44 member organizations representing more than 20,000 occupational hygiene and allied professionals around the world. Through webinars, committees, conferences, communities of practice, and other initiatives, IOHA helps to connect professionals globally to share knowledge, build capability, and advance the common goal of healthier and safer workplaces for all. If you're a member of an IOHA affiliated association and would like to become more involved in one of our committees or projects, we'd love to hear from you. And if you're joining us from a country that does not have a professional association yet, we can provide support and guidance if you'd like to join. More information is available at www.ioha.net. And you can follow, of course, IOHA on LinkedIn to stay up to date with news and upcoming events. I'd like to say a special thank you to Amazon for its continued support of IOHA's education and training activities. Their sponsorship helps make webinars such as today's possible and supports the delivery of high-quality professional development opportunities for our members around the world. Now, for today's presentation, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Cameron Lawrence. He's Assistant Director, Public and Occupational Exposures at the, this is a mouthful, Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, or PANSA for short. Cameron is a radiation protection and occupational exposure specialist with more than 20 years experience across government, mining, heavy industry, and occupational hygiene. At our PANSA, he leads national programs relating to occupational and public radiation exposure and provides expert advice to government, industry, and international organizations, one of which is the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation and the International Atomic Energy Agency. So we are so fortunate to have Cameron with us today to help demystify radiation risk and show how occupational hygienists can apply familiar principles to this important workplace hazard. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cameron Lawrence. So Cameron, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thanks, Julie. G'day, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar and the opportunity to present. Just bring it up on the screen. Go. Presentation mode helps. Right, there we go. That's all good, I assume?
Yep.
Looks great.
Good.
All right, fantastic. So today's presentation is an introduction to radiation protection for occupational hygienists. And look, the aim here isn't to turn everyone into a radiation specialist, but to give you enough background to understand where radiation hazards arise, how the exposure occurs, and what drives the risks associated with it. And then how we go about assessing those risks and then controlling those risks. So over the next 45 minutes, I'm going to cover the radiation basics, your exposure pathways, the dose concepts, the potential health effects, talk a little bit about naturally occurring radioactive materials, which will include background radiation, what controls we have available, what monitoring we use that's a little bit specialised from standard occupational hygiene, go through a handful of case studies, and then I'll have a look at some reliable sources of guidance. The main theme's pretty simple. Radiation's different, but it's not special. It has its own terminology, units, and instrumentation, but the underlying risk management logic should feel very familiar to occupational hygienists. I'm going to start the meeting with an acknowledgement of country, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I meet with you today, which are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. From our scientists to the world's first scientists, we respectfully acknowledge traditional owners and First Nations communities and their rich cultures. We recognise, respect and continue to learn from traditional science knowledges and the deep understanding and observations of land, waters and sky carried and shared by First Nations people over thousands of years. So, looks a bit hefty, but I have split it up into 10 parts. Some of the sections are a bit short. I'll start with a brief introduction to ARPANSA, that's the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency. I'll move into why radiation matters to occupational hygienists. And then we'll start to cover some of the fundamentals. What is radiation, different types of ionising radiation, the exposure pathways, concepts like activity, half-life and dose. And from there, we'll look at the health effects, naturally occurring radioactive material, protection principles, controls and monitoring strategies. I'll finish with a handful of case studies, sources of radiation protection guidance, and a short summary before we go into questions. So, giving the old ARPANSA spiel, for those who aren't familiar with us, we are the Australian Government's primary authority on radiation protection and nuclear safety. Our work covers radiation protection science, regulation, measurement, technical advice, and specialist services. We support government, industry, healthcare providers, and the community on radiation-related matters, and we develop national guidance, which is used across Australia's radiation protection framework. This really summarises our key activities. We develop and maintain the frameworks for radiation protection and safety in Australia. We undertake research and provide expert evaluations, advice and specialist services. So we do have a services branch. We ensure effective and risk-informed regulation. So we have a regulatory services branch that regulates Commonwealth entities such as Defence and ANSTO. We also continue to build capability to respond to emerging radiation and nuclear safety challenges. For today's presentation, the important thing to note is that ARPANSA works across science, regulation and practical radiation protection, which provides a useful lens for discussing radiation from an occupational hygiene perspective. So let's start with a pretty simple question. Why should occupational hygienists care about radiation? May not be something that hygienists deal with every day. It can seem to be more specialised than other hazards that you might be normally used to dealing with, such as dust, noise, chemical management or heat stress. But radiation is present in a wide range of workplaces, including mining, healthcare, other industries, laboratories, waste management, recycling and contaminated land projects. The issue is not whether occupational hygienists need to become radiation experts. The issue is in recognising where radiation may be present and then knowing how to approach that hazard systematically. There's several reasons why radiation matters. It is a workplace hazard. Secondly, it can have both acute and chronic health implications. It may be present in workplaces that do not normally consider themselves to be radiation workplaces. A major difference with radiation and a number of other hazards is that it can't be sensed directly. Workers can't see it, smell it, hear it, or feel it under normal working conditions, such as you might be able to with dust and noise. That means that our assessment relies heavily on understanding the source, the exposure pathway, our monitoring results, and the effectiveness of our controls. So just to come up probably to the main key point I want you to take away from today's webinar is that radiation is different, but it's not special. It has different properties from many other workplace hazards, but the overall risk logic is very familiar. There's a hazard, there's a possibility of exposure. That exposure can result in a dose, and that dose drives the risk. What changes how we assess exposure and how we manage it? Instead of measuring airborne concentration, say in milligrams per cubic meter for dust exposures, we go ahead and perform an estimation of the radiation dose in millisieverts. Instead of relying upon enclosure or ventilation, external radiation protection often uses the principles of time, distance, and shielding. The important point to note is that radiation risk is driven by exposure and dose and not simply the presence of a radiation source. So you should all be very familiar with this slide, and the hygiene framework is directly applicable for radiation protection. We use it. We anticipate the hazard, we recognise, we evaluate, we go ahead and control, and then we confirm our controls. The radiation specific component sits within that evaluation step where we need to move from an exposure through to a dose and then to determine the risk associated with that dose. So that provides us with the risk value for that evaluation. So when we evaluate a radiation scenario, the questions become, what type of radiation is involved? How are the workers exposed? What dose could result? And what risk does that dose represent? So that evaluation step is where all of the radiation science sits. What actually drives that risk? So radiation health effects are commonly divided into deterministic or acute and stochastic or chronic health effects. Deterministic effects are known to occur above a given threshold dose. Once you exceed that threshold, the severity of the effect increases further with more dose. Examples of this include tissue injury, as well as in severe cases, acute radiation syndrome. Stochastic effects are different, and radiation protection generally assumes that there is no threshold for the stochastic risk. Instead, the probability of the effect increases as you increase the dose. Cancer is, of course, the main stochastic effect that's considered in radiation protection, and most routine occupational radiation protection is focused on managing that stochastic risk because the typical control workplaces are well below the levels associated with deterministic risk. Other stochastic risks that we also look at is the development of cataracts and the increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So radiation is encountered across a wide range of workplaces than most people might realise. In mining, radiation may arise from naturally occurring radioactive material, borehole logging, or sources within analytical labs. In industry, radiation sources include a wide range of gauges, industrial radiography work, as well as the analytical labs again. In medicine, obviously, radiation is used in diagnostic imaging, nuclear medicine, cyclotrons and radiotherapy, and radiation may also be encountered in waste management, metal recycling, with orphan source events, and in contaminated land projects. The exposure scenarios are different, but the starting point is always to identify the source and understand how the exposure can occur. So the dose is not determined by the source alone. The dose depends on the radiation type and the energy, the exposure pathway, the time spent near the source, the distance from the source, and what controls you currently have in place. Two workers can be near the same source but receive very different doses because of the difference in tasks, location, and duration. This is why radiation risk assessments need to focus on realistic exposure scenarios and not whether radiation is just present in the workplace. External exposure pathway occurs when the source is outside of the body and the emitted radiation travels from the source and exposes the worker directly. For external exposure, dose is mainly influenced by time, distance, and shielding. The longer you spend near the source, the greater the dose. You increase the distance from the source, you lower the dose, and you put some shielding in place between the source and the worker, it reduces the exposure. This pathway is most relevant for X-rays, gamma radiation, and some beta radiation, depending on the source and the energy. Internal exposure occurs when radioactive material enters the body, and the two main routes are inhalation and ingestion. Entry through wounds is another possible route of contamination, but much less so. Once radioactive material is inside the body, it continues to deliver dose until it's eliminated either biologically or through radioactive decay. It's particularly important for inhalation of radioactive dusts, aerosols, ingestion of contamination in workplaces, the inhalation of radon progeny, and other alpha-emitting radionuclides. For internal exposure, prevention of the intake is our most important control objective. We'll now move into the radiation basic concepts that will support the rest of the presentation. The aim here is not to go too deeply into radiation physics, but to cover enough terminology to help you understand how radiation behaves, how the dose is assessed, and why different types of radiation require different types of controls. So radiation is the emission of energy as waves or particles. In everyday life, we encounter many forms of radiation, including sunlight, radio waves, heat, microwaves. For this presentation, we're going to focus purely on ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is the type of radiation that has enough energy that removes electrons from atoms or molecules, hence creating ions. That ability to ionize matter is what gives ionizing radiation its potential to damage biological tissue. Now, non-ionizing radiation still presents health risks, but it does not produce ionization in tissue. Generally produces a heating of tissue, which then can cause ongoing health risks. And I won't get into the debate about EMR here in this lecture. In this slide, it shows where the energy forms of ionizing radiation sit within the electromagnetic spectrum. So we've got energy forms and we've got particulate forms. This is looking at the energy forms. As your wavelength decreases, your frequency increases, and at the lower end of the spectrum, you're aware we've got radio frequency, radiation, microwaves, infrared, and we move our way down through visible light and the ultraviolet spectrums. As we move further to the right, the energy increases and we move into X-rays and gamma rays as forms of electromagnetic radiation. Energy, not particles. The main distinction here between X-rays and gamma rays is to understand that X-rays are generally artificial in that they're produced electrically through the use of equipment, while gamma rays originate from nuclear processes and occur naturally through radioactive decay. At the end of the day, gamma rays and X-rays, your controls, the way they interact, they're physically basically the same thing. At higher energies, this radiation can interact with atoms and biological molecules such as DNA. If we look at the frequency associated, we're talking about, or the wavelengths associated, we're talking about levels that can interact directly with DNA and water molecules within biological tissue. And that's why ionizing radiation is relevant as a health risk. So while the previous slide showed us ionizing radiation as electromagnetic energy, this slide introduces ionizing radiation as particulates that are emitted from unstable atoms. So if we look at that chart up there on the left-hand side, this is a chart of the radionuclides, and all the stable elements that we're aware that we know of sit in that blue band that's in there. Nuclides that sit outside that in this green band, they are generally long-lived radioisotopes, but they're unstable and they want to decay back to a more stable configuration. So in order to do that, they release particles, energy, or both. Looking up here on the right-hand side, when a nuclide undergoes alpha decay, it emits a particle that's made up of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. It's a helium nucleus, is what it spits out. Beta radiation, on the flip side, is a high energy electron or positron that's emitted during nuclear transformation events. And gamma radiation, as we talked, is an energy that's emitted, and it can be emitted as part of the other processes, or it can just be emitted by itself as a form of the nuclide trying to drop some energy and trying to attain a level of stability. The main distinction, alpha and beta are particles, gamma and X-rays are electromagnetic radiation. Now, I've thrown an example up in here with regards to potassium-40, and the reason why I've done that is because it's a naturally occurring radioisotopes, and it is a demonstration of how one nuclei can actually decay via an option of two pathways. So 89.3% of the time, potassium-40 decays via beta decay, emitting a beta particle, and then transforms into stable calcium-40. But 10.7% of the time, it'll undergo electron capture, and it'll emit a gamma ray as part of that electron capture process, and it will then decay into stable argon-40. The point is that one single radionuclide that's in an environment can be associated with more than one type of radiation. Radiation can also be produced by machines, including your X-ray units, medical linear accelerators, cyclotrons, and other radiation generating equipment. The key distinction is that radiation generators generally only produce radiation when they're energized. When the machine's switched off, the radiation stops. Radioactive materials differ because they continue to emit radiation until they decay, regardless of whether anyone's using them or not. The distinction matters for maintenance, emergency planning, access control, and your exposure assessments. Activity is a description of the number of radioactive decays that occur across a given time. The SI unit of activity is the becquerel, and 1 becquerel is 1 radioactive decay per second. You may also encounter the Curie. That's a US unit that's still in use. It's also the older unit, so it's the imperial unit, and it can also be found in a wide range of literature. 1 Curie is 3.7 times 10 to the 10 becquerels, or 37 gigabecquerels. Important point to note is that the activity is a description of the source. It does not tell us anything about the dose. A high activity source, which is well shielded, can present a low exposure risk, while a low activity source with no controls can present a higher risk if it's unshielded, dispersed, or even inhaled. Activity is really only one part of your exposure assessment. Half-life, it's a pretty simple concept. It describes how quickly radioactive material decays. It's the time required for the activity to decay to half its original value. After one half-life, you've got half, 2, you've got a quarter, etc., etc. Different radionuclides have different half-lives. You have some very short-lived radionuclides whose existence we really only discovered through luck, I guess. And then you have a wide range of long-lived radionuclides like the naturally occurring uranium, thorium, and actinium series. The half-life matters because it influences how we store radioactive materials, how we manage the waste from them, what contamination controls we need to put in place, how we perform maintenance, and how long a source remains relevant from an exposure assessment. So while the activity tells us about the source, the dose tells us about the exposure. Now there's 2 main SI units for exposure, and those are the gray and the sievert. The gray is a measure of the absorbed dose. It describes the amount of energy that's deposited per kilogram of material, and 1 gray is the equivalent of 1 joule per kilo. The sievert then goes further by accounting for the biological significance of that exposure. We have 2 concepts that use the sievert. One is the equivalent dose, which accounts for the type of radiation, because some radiation types cause more biological damage than others. And then we have the effective dose, or better known as a whole body dose. Effective dose also accounts for the radiosensitivity of the different tissues within the body. So some tissues are more radiosensitive than others. In occupational radiation protection, we generally talk about exposure in millisieverts. Medical radiation physicists will talk about absorbed dose in grey when they're delivering radiotherapy treatments. You'll also find the older units, or the non-SI units of RAD and REM. These are still used in the United States, and you'll find them in some older technical documentation. At the end of the day, one gray is 100 RAD, 1 sievert's 100 REM. So if you do see these units, the point is to recognize that they are also units of radiation exposure, and the conversion's pretty simple. This slide explains why radiation protection uses the sievert as opposed to just the grey. The grey measures the energy deposited into the tissue, but that biological effect depends on the type of radiation and the radiosensitivity of the tissue. So looking at the left-hand table, you can see that alpha particles, for example, have a radiation weighting factor of 20, which makes them a lot more potentially damaging for tissue than, say, X-rays and gamma rays, which just have a radiation weighting factor of 1. So that also makes alpha-emitting material particularly more damaging if the material enters the body. The tissue weighting factor then accounts for the fact that different organs and tissues have different sensitivities. At the end of the day, if you're standing in a field of radiation, you do account for all of the organs, and that's a whole body dose. Generally, when you receive a dose of radiation, even if it's inside the body, they'll translate it to an effective dose to the whole body. Now that we've covered the basic language of activity, half-life, and dose, we'll look more directly at what radiation dose means in terms of the health effects. So this slide distinguishes between deterministic and stochastic effects. Deterministic effects commonly involve tissue injury. They occur, as I mentioned earlier, only after a specific threshold is exceeded. And once that threshold exceeded, both the likelihood and severity of the injury increases. Stochastic effects are mainly based around the risk of cancer, and that's where most radiation protection is focused on. Dose influences the probability that an effect may occur, not the severity of the disease if it occurs. So of particular interest to draw your attention to on this slide is this chart. And it illustrates the several models that are proposed to describe cancer risk at low doses of radiation. And it is the fundamental foundation for radiation protection globally. So the black dots actually represent the actual epidemiological data that we have. And most of that data sits at a range well above 100 millisieverts. So we know there we're pretty much dealing with a linear scenario where you increase the dose and you get a linear response. However, at low doses, the risk becomes increasingly difficult to measure because we've got things like background radiation and there's other complexities, lifestyle, all of that sort of stuff that goes to mess up your epidemiological models. And because of these uncertainties, a number of different models have been proposed, and all of these models have got some form of evidence behind them to support them. There is the model that some suggest a threshold below which no additional risk occurs, as we can see in the purple line. Others propose hormesis, where very low doses of radiation, like background radiation, may even have a beneficial effect, as we can see in the green line. And then there's the hypersensitivity models that predict higher risks at lower doses, which is given by the orange line. Generally, worldwide, radiation protection uses the linear no threshold model, which is given by this blue line. That means that any additional dose is assumed to carry some additional risk, and that risk increases with dose. So that is the conservative assumption that supports and underpins radiation protection practice and supports our optimization principles and keeping doses as low as reasonably achievable. The dose rate also matters. The same total dose can have different biological consequences depending on whether it's received over seconds, hours, months, or years. High doses received over short time can overwhelm biological repair mechanisms, may lead to deterministic effects. The same dose received over longer periods of time may just result in stochastic risks. How it actually interacts at a cellular level, ionizing radiation causes damage by depositing energy across tissue. Damage occurs directly through interaction with DNA or chemical changes in the cell, and particularly through interactions with water molecules, creating free radicals. DNA damage may include a single or a double strand break or other chemical changes to the cell. Most damage is repaired successfully, but problems do arise when that damage is not repaired or it's repaired incorrectly, which can lead to cell death, mutation, and other longer-term health effects. Radiotherapy is a good example where this principle is actually used to help cure a patient, where radiation is targeted directly to kill cancer cells by using that impact of single and double strand breaks to just damage it while attempting to minimize the dose to surrounding healthy tissues. I'll briefly touch upon a concept that's used particularly with the intake of radionuclides. So when radioactive material enters the body, physical radioactive decay is only part of the story. You're probably well aware of biological half-life, which is the biological mechanisms that remove material from the body. However, when you combine these two, so the intake of a radioisotope, you end up getting what's called the effective half-life, which combines the effect of elimination and radioactive decay. The example that's given there is iodine-131. It's got a physical half-life of 8.1 days, biological half-life of 138. It results in an effective half-life of 7.6 days. This is really important, and all of the background internal dose modelling for exposures delivered after an uptake of a radionuclide are based upon these effective half-lives. Putting it all into context, at the low end, we have really controlled environments where our annual occupational doses are generally below a millisievert. Examples are such as diagnostic radiology facilities, analytical laboratories, using industrial gauges or performing environmental monitoring. This range focuses really on good practice, general monitoring, and continued optimization. We've got the moderate range between the 1 and 20 millisieverts per year where many formal radiation protection programs operate. These include, say, your interventional cardiology, nuclear medicine, uranium and norm processing, and industrial radiography. At these levels, deterministic effects are not expected outside potential accidents, say with an industrial radiography source, but cumulative dose and the stochastic risk become extremely important to manage and keep doses as low as reasonably achievable. At the high end, doses above 100 millisieverts received over a short period, deterministic effects can become a concern. However, we need to recognise that these are not normal occupational exposure situations and they are associated with incidents, uncontrolled sources, radiotherapy or radiography accidents, and other severe contamination events. I'll move on to something that might be a bit more familiar to hygienists, and that's naturally occurring radioactive material, or NORM, and I'll go into a little bit of background radiation with this. NORM includes radionuclides such as uranium, thorium, actinium, and potassium-40, which occur naturally in the Earth's crust. These materials can contribute to exposure through external gamma radiation, inhalation of dusts, the inhalation of radon and radon progeny, as well as their ingestion through food and water consumption. Natural radiation also comes from space. Look up in the sky, there's a giant nuclear fusion reactor. The sun and the stars produce cosmic radiation. The Earth's magnetic field and the atmosphere provide us with shielding, but some cosmic radiation still reaches the surface. Exposure increases with altitude because there's less atmospheric shielding, and this is one of the reasons why aviation workers are some of the highest occupationally exposed workers outside of the nuclear sector. Human activity can change your exposure conditions. Mining, ore processing, mineral concentration, working underground, aviation all increase your exposure above normal background levels. A particular shout out to radon and thoron. These are both radioactive gases that are produced in the uranium and thorium decay chains. There is a third one called actinon that's produced in the actinium decay chain, but it's got an extremely short half-life. Radon and thoron are gases that are released from all of the rocks and soils all over the planet because there are trace quantities of uranium and thorium. They are the only gases to be found in the decay chains, so therefore it allows it to be released and get into the atmosphere where it can be inhaled, then goes ahead and converts into a range of short-lived solid progeny. And the main health risk is not through the inhalation of radon or thoron, but through the inhalation of that radioactive decay products. because they attach to aerosol and dust particles. There's a few of them in there that are alpha emitters, and when you inhale them, they deposit into the respiratory tract and deliver a dose directly to the lungs. So radon is recognised as a hazard in a number of countries around the world, and also in various workplaces, including underground mines, caves, tunnels, basements, and some indoor environments that have poor ventilation. Oops. So just to put it into context, natural and artificial radiation exposure exists. Everyone receives radiation exposure from the natural sources, cosmic radiation, external radiation from rocks and soils. The chart on the left-hand side indicates a piece of work that I was involved with the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, looking at public exposures, and it provided a modern estimate of exposure to natural radiation. And we see radon and thorin inhalation, or the inhalation of progeny, is dominating that pathway with about 60% of exposure. We also then, flipping over to the right-hand side, this is our Panza chart, which also incorporates then medical exposure to the Australian population. So if you look at the combination here, we're talking medical exposures contributing just over 50% of the Australian population exposure to all sources of radiation, not just, At the end of the day, radiation protection is about isn't about eliminating all exposure. It's about understanding when your exposures are significant and ensuring that they're properly controlled. So here's a few pictures you might be familiar with. Norm can be encountered in many industries, uranium mining being the obvious example. It's also relevant to mineral sands, rare earth processing, oil and gas through scales build-up in pipes, underground mining obviously through the build-up of radon, and phosphate fertilizer production with all of these wonderful phosphogypsum stacks that are around the world. In many industries, radiation is not the primary hazard. Workers may also be dealing with dust, chemical, heat, manual handling, confined spaces, and other process hazards. Radiation becomes just one additional exposure pathway that needs to be characterised and managed. We'll now move from the sources and exposure pathways into protection principles and controls. This section covers the formal radiation protection principles and some practical control methods that we use. You can't go past starting beyond the fundamentals. There are three foundational principles for radiation protection, and that's justification, optimization, and limitation. Justification means that every activity involving radiation should do more harm than good. There needs to be a valid reason for exposure. Optimization means that you need to keep your exposures as low as reasonably achievable, taking into account economic and societal factors. Limitation means that dose limits are used to ensure workers and members of the public don't receive doses above established regulatory limits. In day-to-day radiation protection, optimization is the most active principle because that's the one that we work towards to ensure we keep doses as low as reasonably achievable. Another slide you'll be very familiar with. We use exactly the same hierarchy of controls. Where possible, the hazard should be eliminated or substituted. If that's not possible, isolation or control through engineering mechanisms. Administrative and PPE controls may still be required, but obviously not your primary source of control. For radiation, the exact control depends on whether the exposure is external, internal, or both. The three basic control methods that we use predominantly for external radiation exposure are time, distance, and shielding. You reduce the time near the source, you reduce your dose. You increase the distance, you will reduce your dose. Radiation follows what's called the inverse square law. So if you double the distance, you will quarter the dose. And then shielding, which places material between the worker and the source, can also be used and is dependent upon the radiation type and energy. Now, engineering controls are especially important, particularly where material may become airborne or spread as contamination. Ventilation, very commonly used to control radon, thorin, and other radioactive dusts, particularly in mines, tunnels, laboratories in the form of fume hoods, as well as confined spaces. Fume cupboards, glove box, and filtered extraction systems may be used to capture the radioactive materials, particularly if contamination's an issue, such as like ANSTO, they pump stuff through filtration, HEPA filters to capture it so it's not released to the environment. You also have other controls for X-ray systems. Interlocks are used commonly on X-rays, accelerators, and in beam lines, which prevents exposure when the access points are opened. And then we also find shielding systems such as a hot cell, which are used, which provide significant shielding for workers to perform using remote manipulators to handle the radioactive material inside the hot cell. The objective is really to separate the worker from the source and the pathway of exposure. I'll briefly touch on the end of the day. Shielding depends on the radiation type, what energy is emitted. There's a variety of tables that you can find in literature about the half value layer, and it's essentially how much of a material you need to reduce the radiation to half the value for a given source. You can see in the table you've got iridium and cobalt-60 in the various types of material. For some radionuclides, we can just use time as a control. So radioactive decay occurs, and there are a whole bunch of short-lived radionuclides that occur within nuclear fission. So in reactor and in the nuclear sector, delay and decay is a technique that's used very commonly. If a radionuclide has a short half-life, delaying work can substantially reduce radiation levels. It's used significantly in nuclear waste management. In nuclear medicine, hospitals will just store stuff in the basement until it decays away, even to a level that they can just dispose of via normal sewage pathways. And you can also use this technique for maintenance planning. So I was at ANSTO recently for an inspection, and when they shut down their hot cells, they wait 2 weeks before they go in to allow predominantly some of the short-lived radionuclides to decay away. It's not always available, but where it is, it's something to consider. Can you just park it up for a week? This slide summarises the dose limits that are used in Australia for planned exposure situations. For adult radiation workers, the effective dose limit's 20 millisieverts per year, averaged over 5 years, with no more than 50 millisieverts in a single year. For members of the public, the limit's much lower at 1 millisievert a year. That difference reflects that obviously occupational exposed workers are trained, monitored, and working within controlled systems. There's also separate limits for particular tissues, including the lens of the eye to avoid cataracts, skins, hands and feet. The limits are much higher for their extremities, skins and hands and feet, because localized exposures to these tissues don't carry the same whole body risks that are represented by the whole body effective risk. Whole body effective dose. The important point is that dose limits are regulatory boundaries and not targets. I certainly know regulators start to get very cranky when you start hitting about half the annual exposure limit. Once controls are in place, the next question, of course, is whether they are working through confirmation. And that's where our monitoring programs come in. Helps us determine whether workers are being exposed, how much exposure is occurring, and whether your controls are effective. Monitoring starts with identifying who may be exposed, and we use a similar system of the similar exposure groups that you'd be familiar with based on task materials, exposure pathways, and likely dose. So even at a site, say, a uranium mining site, we would break the uranium miners down further into more segs, but this gives you a general idea of some high-level segs. So a uranium miner worker would be exposed to radon progeny, radioactive dust, and external gamma, while a nuclear medicine technology would have external exposure and a contamination pathway. So by identifying the segs and identifying the potential exposure pathways, that helps drive the monitoring program that we're going to use. Personal monitoring is extensively used in radiation protection, mainly because it's actually available and it's cheap. And it can be used to determine the dose that the worker themselves receive. For external X-ray or gamma exposure, it often involves the use of OSL, optically stimulated luminescent badges, or thermoluminescent dosimetry. Electronic personal dosimeters, plenty of them around. They're pretty cheap as well, and they give you a direct reading. Then you can also get eye and extremity dosimeters in the form of rings or attachments on the side of safety glasses. We will commonly use techniques that you'd be very familiar with, such as personal dust sampling, to take an inhalable dust sample, throw it under a radiation counter, and then run it through some calculations to convert that into a dose. And we will apply the average of that dose across a seg to get individual exposure assessments. Radon and radon progeny, there are a bunch of edge track monitors that do a passive monitoring. There are some real-time monitors, but the progeny has some really specialist limited options. Workplace monitoring then focuses on the work environment. We use survey meters to measure radiation dose rates, contamination meters, such as this one here, to identify radioactive contamination on surfaces, equipment, or people. And we may use radon monitors in underground environments, such as caves and other workplaces, to identify where radon may be a problem. We also use dust samplers to check the effectiveness of various controls, and again, then we could throw those. We can throw the sample under a radiation monitor and determine doses from that for work areas. Workplace monitoring helps identify whether hazards are present, whether our controls are effective, and whether the conditions are changing over time. At the end of the day, our data only becomes useful once it's interpreted. And the questions on this slide are the ones that you should matter after you've performed it. Are your workers actually being exposed? What's your dominant exposure pathway? Are your controls effective? Are the results changing over time? Having a look at the trends. Are the results consistent with your original exposure assessment? And do you need to perform any changes to your monitoring program? Remember, the purpose of monitoring is not just to collect data. The purpose is to support decisions about exposure, risk, and your control effectiveness. So that to finish the technical part of the presentation, I'll just go through some case studies and give you an example of some different radiation exposure scenarios. So Olympic Dam is a large underground mine and processing facility that produces copper, gold, uranium, and silver. From a radiation perspective, there are many exposure pathways. Underground workers are exposed to radon progeny, radioactive dusts, and external gamma radiation in the underground ore environment. Processing plant workers encounter concentrates, smelter fume, uranium oxide, and other processed materials with radioactive material. The site also uses a wide range of artificial radiation sources, including gauges, and has laboratories with analytical equipment. What makes Olympic Dam useful as a case study is that radiation is managed alongside all of the other workplace hazards that you find in a mine. Different tasks create different exposure pathways, so we need to. So it has a well-formed similar exposure groups that incorporates the radiation and hygiene exposures across there. I had the experience of working at Olympic Dam as a radiation and occupational hygiene specialist for 5 years earlier in my career. Now, this is an interesting case back in the 80s and 90s. This case involved an orphan cobalt-60 source. So this is a industrial radiography source, very similar to the one pictured, about 5 centimeters long, and it entered the scrap metal recycling stream in Taiwan in the early 1980s. They believed it was sometime in 1982 or 1983. Contaminated steel was manufactured from that, and that was used to produce rebar, which was used in more than 200 buildings across Taiwan. Now, this actually wasn't discovered as an issue until 1992, when a worker who was using a survey meter detected elevated radiation levels. Further investigation found that, discovered the contaminated rebar, discovered the number of buildings. They did massive building surveys, and that about 10,000 people had been exposed to doses from a few millisieverts to up to 100 millisieverts over about a decade. Two things here. One, it became a really good case study for low-dose radiation risks. It's still being studied in detail today. But also the second one, it became a foundation for radiation screening becoming a control in scrap metal recycling business across the world. So I don't think you'll find a scrap metal business in Australia today that doesn't have a radiation contamination meter at its front gate. Hunters Hill, this is an Australian example of legacy contamination from historical industrial activity. Site was associated with tin smelting and radium-related production. So radium was a big thing for the medical industry as well as its luminescent properties prior to about 1930, maybe 1940. And this site had contamination. It was initially cleared in like the 1930s, and then residencies were built on top of it. And then eventually when the contamination was discovered, those residents had to be knocked down and remediation had to occur. Prime property in Sydney, Australia, overlooking the harbour. But the remediation project, I know the general manager of the company that helped deal with this. They underwent a major remediation for 3 years, stabilised the site. His words were, "We scraped it back to the bedrock," essentially, is what they had to do. This shows you that broader radiation hazards can persist long after operations had ceased. The Litvinenko case involved exposure through poisoning to polonium-210 in London in 2006. This is a very clear example of the potential impacts of alpha-emitting radionuclides in very, very high doses as an internal exposure pathway. It demonstrates the impact that alpha radiation can have inside the body due to that heavy radiation weighting factor. Initially, the cause of his illness was not recognised and hazard identification was delayed. Once it was identified that polonium-210 was the source of his illness, investigators undertook extensive contamination and they monitored across multiple locations where they identified significant contamination had been spread through the initial assessment and investigation process. This case demonstrates the importance of recognising unusual exposure pathways, tracing your contamination and understanding the difference between the external and internal hazards. Briefly touch on radiation protection requirements, regulations. Our regulations that are used around the world come from a combination of legislation, national guidance, international standards and scientific recommendations. At the end of the day, for a workplace, the practical question is usually who is your relevant regulator and what requirements apply to the work that you're doing. So if you're dealing with it, the first place I would look at is your relevant state, territory or national regulator. Regulators will provide you with the legal requirements, licensing information, codes, guides, dose limits, and their compliance expectations. Now, to get an idea, however, where the local regulations have been derived from, the International Atomic Energy Agency provides a wide range of safety standards, safety guides, technical documents, and glossaries. And predominantly around the world, they represent best practice, and national and state regulators will utilise their documentation to draw upon into their own codes, guides, and regulations. We have another international organisation, the International Commission on Radiological Protection, the ICRP. Now, this organisation provides the scientific basis for many of the radiation protection concepts. So where I was talking a lot about the various models, the linear no threshold model, and the scientific effects and impacts, that's what the ICRP does. So essentially, the IAEA provides guidance to help regulators make decisions. The ICRP provides the scientific basis behind the system of radiation protection. There's a little bit of crossover, but it can get a bit complicated with that. So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've started with why radiation matters in occupational hygiene, worked through the radiation types, exposure pathways, activity, half-life, dose, health effects, norm, various controls, monitoring, and case studies. The technical details matter, but the overall structure is pretty straightforward. Radiation risk depends on the source, the pathway, the dose, and your controls. The key message, radiation is different, but not special. It's another workplace hazard that requires structured assessment and management. Your risk is determined purely by the dose and your exposure pathways. Your internal exposures need to be prevented wherever possible. External exposure can usually be controlled through effective uses of time, distance, and shielding. Your monitoring programs need to be risk-based and focused on the relevant exposure pathways. And while the terminology and tools are different, the risk management logic through your hygiene principles remains extremely familiar. If you remember nothing else and you're confronted with a radiation issue, start with these questions. What is the source? What is the type of radiation involved? What are the exposure pathways? Who can be exposed? What dose could realistically occur? Are your controls effective? And is any monitoring required? If you can answer those questions, you're already applying the core logic of radiation protection. I've included this slide as reference for further reading. For Australian material, UPHANS's Radiation Protection Series provides codes, fundamentals, guides, and other regulatory publications. As I mentioned just before, the IAEA provides international safety standards, technical guides, and glossaries, and the ICRP provides scientific recommendations. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention and participation. I hope that today's webinar has helped demystify radiation protection and shown how radiation hazards can be controlled and approached systematically. Radiation involves different units, instruments, and technical concepts, but the practical task remains the same. Understand the source, understand the exposure pathway, assess the dose and the risk, implement your controls, and verify that those controls are working. Thank you for your time. There's the QR code for the certificate of attendance sitting up there on the screen. And now I'm happy to take any questions that they might appear in the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cameron. That was excellent. Great. Yeah, there are a few questions. One I might have snuck in myself as a Canadian, because you mentioned earlier that radon is a problem in other countries. Canada is one of those countries. Actually, I've got I don't know if you can see it on the graph, but I still have my little flyer from over there where it's quite an issue because everything red is pretty high in radon. So I was a bit surprised when I came to Australia to find that although there's a lot of uranium production and mining and whatnot, we don't actually have the same concern. What can you tell me why that is, what the differences are?
Yeah, there's a few reasons, and predominantly in Australia, our houses are built for our summers and not our winters, so our houses are typically much more well ventilated. We don't have basements as a common building situation in Australia as in our structures, so that also eliminates one major pathway for radon to accumulate within houses. Australia is also a very old geological country, and while we do have a lot of uranium and uranium deposits, our general soil uranium concentrations are slightly lower than the rest of the world, and that also reduces it. But predominantly, it's the ventilation in our houses. So our IOHA did a survey in 1990. Showed I think our average exposure across Australia is about 13 becquerels per cubic metre. Now you can compare that to the radon map that you just popped up, the Canadian radon map, where some of those red zones will be in the hundreds of becquerels per cubic metre, with the action limit sitting at around 200. So yeah, while we do have a few unique cases of people who come to us and say, I've got high radon and stuff like that, we generally find that, those houses have got basements, they've got strange sources that are occurring, or they've got really high, low ventilation.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if it's basements an issue, and that's certainly the case, in my daughter's house, we had a radon monitor, and it was hitting about 175 becquerel, so it was getting close to that action level. But if you've got an office building in Australia that's going subfloor, like below ground, would that also be a consideration? You mentioned the Olympic Dam. Did they have high levels of radon?
Yeah, Olympic Dam does have significant radon concentrations. It's actually a relatively low-grade uranium ore body. I mean, it's predominantly there for the copper, and the uranium is associated with the ore body in an economic enough value that once they've extracted the ore, it's worth extracting the uranium. So there is significant radon issues and at Olympic Dam, and a lot of the controls, a lot of your underground ventilation controls are based around controlling that. the rule of thumb that I learned from there, and I notice there's an ex-colleague from Olympic Dam in the meeting today. The rule of thumb I was given there was if you can control for diesel particulates, you control for radon. Now that might change a little bit over the as we move in if more electric vehicles are being used in production. It's been over a decade since I've been involved in mining, but yeah, we might see some changes. But the rule of thumb that we gave our ventilation engineers was if you control for the diesel particulates, you'll deal with the radon. Underground buildings, we actually don't have good data in Australia on public places for radon. The housing survey is 30 years old. Before I went over to my secondment, I kicked off an updated radon survey in a couple of cities over in Perth and in Canberra, and we're to update our housing information because of the changes in house design over the last 20 years, where Australian houses have become more energy efficient, but we're still waiting for the results to come back. They're 12-month sampling that we're doing in those houses. Underground buildings, look, at the end of the day, buildings that have got an underground car park or something like that, the concrete barrier will generally provide enough protection to deal with it. And then if they're deep enough, they'll have to have some form of ventilation in there as well.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, because the air tightness will have an impact on how much can concentrate in those areas, I guess now. Yeah. Thank you. Great. Excellent. Oh, so another question that has come up is as an occupational hygienist, if what kind of tools would you recommend that we should start to accumulate? Like what should we go out and get a gamma meter? Should we get like what would be a good starting point if we were going to be looking into doing occupational studies?
So I would probably look, a gamma meter, I mean, you've got the three principal types. You've got your alpha, beta, and gamma. So a gamma meter is not going to pick up alpha and beta contamination. But gamma meters themselves are reasonably cheap. I think of the order of $1,000 still will get you a reasonable gamma meter. So if you know actually what it is you're chasing, then it's pretty easy just to go and buy the meter that's associated with it. Just trying to that one. So yeah, you can get units that have a mix of gamma, alpha, and beta monitors on them, and it's not, as I said, it's not the ABC. So a unit like a RadioGem, Canberra or Miriam RadioGem, this actually comes with a not on this, but this actually comes with a probe that you can an additional probe that you can attach to it. That's got an alpha and beta monitoring source. So it's a multiple unit that you can buy. I think you spend about $1,500 or so on this unit, and then another $1,000 will get you the probe attachments for it. So at the end of the day, though, if you're just hunting something, like if you're not sure, probably just reach out and ask. There's a lot of consultants in the industry as well, and they'll have monitors. So yeah, you could also reach out to a radiation consultant.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I think I've used that Pancake version that's on the bottom right screen there. But yeah. If
Sorry,
there's any tips or tricks on how to approach, that would be good too. Like in terms of going up and testing, say, pipe work for scaling, like you showed.
So this unit here, or unit's very similar to it. It's commonly called a pancake probe, as you can see for the thing. They do also come in square versions, but essentially for the surface contamination or detecting alpha and beta contamination, because we're talking about radiation that's got a range of a few centimeters at best in air, you do need to get close to the contamination, which means you need access. So for Australian uranium mines, a common practice is to perform radiation clearances on equipment that's been inside, the term's called a controlled area, and that's an area where the radioactive material is present. You'd have to perform a radiation clearance, so technicians go down and use a pancake probe device. They need to open the engine bay, they need to get under the vehicle, they need to be able to scan the vehicle in its entirety to look for any forms of contamination. When I was working at Ranger Uranium Mine, so a lot of my work was involved performing radiation clearances, and it was a little bit surprising, some of the issues that you could find. We didn't have too much of an issue with scales, being a uranium mine. Scales are found more in, it's the norm slide. So scales are typically found more in oil and gas. Now, scales generally involves a radium buildup, and radium's got a decent gamma emission associated with it. So there's absolutely no, with half a centimetre or so of steel, there would be no issue with going up and sticking a gamma meter next to this, and you would have some idea that there's something in there. It wouldn't give you a decent reading, but you'd have some idea. But if you put a pancake probe on that, that would be screaming, because you're directly then picking up the alphas and betas that are being emitted. So the aim is, when you're looking for contamination, is to get close. There's some real weird chemical interactions that occur through oxidization process and etching processes that can occur. So you might be looking at something that's completely clean, yet it's had etched material. I've obviously only encountered those in uranium mining. So yellow cake has got yellow cake can etch into material. So you could be staring at a piece of steel that's completely clean and shiny, and go and stick a pancake probe on it, and it'll start screaming because of the alphas that are coming off.
Wow.
And
Excellent.
Controls for that are generally, in an industrial setting, we did a lot of sandblasting. So we'd have a sandblasting yard, and we'd just send stuff down to the sandblasting yard to sandblast, and then we deal with the waste through the tailings.
So you'd have to make sure you capture all the particles, you sandblast it off, because they'd be the radiation source. Okay.
Yep.
Interesting. Yep. All right. So there was a question in the in the chat. I don't know if I can see that now. I see that there is some issues with the QR code. So I think our president-elect has posted that in there. People are trying to scan that for continuing maintenance points. So thank you so much. It was about, it's going up to the front. It said, where is the neutron, thermal or slow? And Patrick says there was a slide earlier on showing radiation, but neutron wasn't mentioned. Does that make sense?
Look, I did not go into neutrons, because that is very much a, you're definitely in the nuclear industry if you're going to be playing with neutrons. Neutrons is another source. There's some, I'm trying to find it. Neutrons is another form of radiation. It is emitted from, there's some higher up radiation sources that naturally emit neutrons. It's got a heavy weighting factor as well, so depending on their energy, so their weighting factor is actually scaled depending on the neutron energy. But look, at the end of the day, all of the neutrons are in nuclear fission, which when you split it, you're generating more neutrons that you need to moderate to, but then they go and split more. It's the neutrons that then go and split more atoms. But university sources and stuff like that, when I was at uni, we had a neutron source. There's a topic I didn't go into here was about neutron activation, and that is neutrons basically slam themselves into an atom and join with that atom, and if they don't have enough energy to split it, they will then activate that atom and make it radioactive. So an experiment we used to do at uni was we stick gold into the neutron source, little gold foil, and we produce, I think it was gold, anyway, produce radioactive gold, and you pull it out and it's got a really short half-life. But that's because the neutrons are slamming in and joining the gold atoms, and then as you pull it out, they're unstable and they undergo radioactive decay. So yeah, neutron activation is one of the processes that you may find if there's been a neutron source in an area and you remove it or you switch it off, that you will still have some residual radioactivity. Most neutron activation products have relatively short half-lives, the order of, I don't think there's much out there that's got more than a day or two of half-life, just off the top of my head. But yeah, certainly it is a potential pathway. But you've got neutron sources, you're going to be well within the nuclear sector. It's not a, yep.
Right. Is that the principle then behind nuclear power, the neutron rods?
Yeah. The neutron, they have a neutron source to kick off the reaction, which then splits the uranium atoms or the nuclear fuel, which has got enough uranium-235 in it, because then when the uranium-235 splits, it produces excess neutrons, and then of enough energy that they can produce more fission. So they will go and split atoms further down the chain. And carbon is a neutron moderator. So they have large carbon rods that they sink into the reactor to moderate essentially the accelerator on a nuclear reactor. You pull the rods up and down to make the reaction go faster or slower. Or graphite, sorry. Yeah, graphite and carbon. And that's, yeah, it is essentially that process. And then they're splitting it, and then you end up, so uranium, 238, 235, and then you end up with generally two equally weighted nuclides that are both radioactive. So the splits usually, like, cesium-137 is a common byproduct, so that's almost half. Cobalt-60 is a common byproduct, it's a bit less than half. But yeah, you've got all these radionuclides that are byproducts that are roughly in that range of about half that 238, 235 range.
Interesting. All right, I am going to post a little picture into the chat too. It's of some tiles that I've seen. One thing I wanted to ask about is other potential sources of radioactive material, like dishware or tiles. We had an issue in a hospital where the workers were breaking up ceramic tiles, didn't realize they had radioactive glaze in them, and they were inhaling the particles. Is there anything you can expand on that for Australia or what you've seen here?
Yeah, so, oh yeah, somebody's put a picture. That's you, yep. So uranium glaze was used very commonly in the late 1800s through the early 1900s. It's got that beautiful, absolutely gorgeous, distinct green hue to it. And that, yeah, look, it's essentially uranium mixed with the glass that produces that. But yeah, it's predominantly an alpha emitter. That's its main route of the main risk for the exposure pathway, and the breaking it up then has the potential to make it airborne, and it's then that inhalation of the dust where you start to get uranium inside the body that becomes the risk. So just applying back to stock standard hygiene principles of any changing state of materials, essentially any dust generation, anything like that is going to cause a problem if you've got radioactive material in place. Doing that sort of work, you would expect, if you applied the same controls as you did to asbestos management, you're fine, basically, at the end of the day. Except you have to manage except good luck getting rid of the waste at your local industrial hazard landfill. Which, because that will not happen. Yep, you will. There's a radioactive waste stores around the country in Australia that have got a lot of this stuff floating around.
I would be saying, you mentioned that in recycling facilities that people have a radiation meter. I've been to a couple recently, and that's news to me. That was a really interesting topic. So I think I will address that in the future.
Yeah, so the recycling facilities, where is it? I put the picture in the wrong spot. This is a gate monitor that's here, and scrap metal recycling yards very commonly in Australia will have a radiation monitor to avoid the risk. I know several years ago, I remember reading reports of a couple going off in Adelaide on a regular occurrence through various, I think it was nuclear medicine sources going through them. Like not massive amounts of stuff, but just enough. Like they've just got a above background threshold sort of thing. So even if you throw some naturally occurring radioactive material in them, it can set it off. So I'm just having a look through the chat.
Chat. And I'm looking at the Q&A. There's a couple more. It said, Cameron, you mentioned that radiation protection extends core hygiene practice rather than being an outlier. What's one assumption or misconception that hygienists commonly bring from their work with other hazards that doesn't fit or needs significant adjustment when applying it to radiation specifically?
I think
you've addressed that.
Yeah, probably the misconception is that any source is a hazard. So, for example, I was working at a place at an aluminium smelter, and somebody they were collecting all of the old smoke detectors around site, so they were replacing them with radioactive ones, and they had a box of smoke detectors in their room, and now a smoke detector is an alpha emitter, range of a couple of centimeters in air. Putting them in a box in a corner of your room's absolutely fine. There's no exposure pathway whatsoever. But then, somebody's like, oh, they're radioactive sources, you shouldn't be storing them in your office, etc., etc. Look, just for the sake of it, move them out of the office, go put them somewhere else. But at the end of the day, it's one of those things where it's like the source does not directly mean that there's a risk associated with it. So that's probably the largest misconception that anyone, hygienists or anyone, just someone says radiation, and then there's this automatic perception that you've got Chernobyl going on in whatever room or building or part of the process that's occurring. But at the end of the day, it really isn't. You need to assess the dose and risk and stuff that's associated with it.
You've got a lot of thumbs up there.
Just looking at a couple there was a case where a Japanese worker who died from measuring radiation dose from one of the reactors. So be careful when you're measuring. Again, that's within the nuclear industry. Outside of the nuclear industry, for hygienists, probably the largest risk would be industrial radiography sources. There have been a number of industrial radiography sources drop out of, or even borehole logging sources. They're pretty much the same thing. They drop out of their canisters over the years. There was a classic case here in Australia a few years back, and they are hot. Like they are extremely radioactive as a source unto itself, that if you were, there are many cases around the world where people have picked them up, and that's that little thing that fell into that Taiwan, so something like about 5 centimeters long, right? There are some radio, in Russia, they used it a lot. They used radio thermic generators where they actually glow, like they're red hot, because of the nuclear decay that's occurring in them. But yeah, these things, they looks like a piece of metal sitting on the ground, looks like an interesting piece of metal sitting on the ground. And there are many cases around the world where people have picked these up, put them in their pocket, and either died or had limbs removed because of the exposure that they've given. There are many examples around the world where people have taken them home and exposed and killed their family as a result of it.
Oh
so there's some, so it is one of those things. I would say as a hygienist, if you are on an industrial site and you're getting your industrial radiographers coming around, just keep an eye on them, have a look at their radiation management plans, make sure they take the source home. And make sure they've confirmed they take the source home. But yeah, with regards to the question about the radiation worker dying from measuring in a nuclear reactor, again, you're talking about high exposure scenarios, which are generally not they don't occur in norm processing. They don't occur in analytical labs. Even in radiography accidents, the worst things that are occurring there is people are giving themselves extremely bad skin burns or giving patients skin burns because the equipment hasn't been calibrated properly.
Gosh.
Somebody's got
yeah. Oh, sorry. Go.
Somebody's got a question there. How can we determine the level of radiation inside our body? Can it be detected through urine or feces? So through ingestion, there's three main mechanisms by which you can determine the ingestion or the dose, actually. But yeah, urine sampling, very common, and feces sampling, less preferred. You can generally get the same information out of the urine sampling, which is there's a sort of a split. It's like 80-20 or something like that. So if you just collect the urine, which is obviously easier to deal with, not that any of that collection's pleasant, but collecting the urine, you can then calculate across for the amount excreted through other mechanisms. You can also, in some cases, particularly for inhalation of iodine, 131, or cesium in the body, that sort of stuff, you can do whole body scans using whole body monitors, but we used to have one in Australia. It's not operating at the moment. I think ANSTO might have one. But when I was looking at that, when you look at this one, so that's essentially it's a gamma camera just taking, that's an image of the thyroid, poor quality old image, but that's actually a gamma camera taking an image of a human body with radioactive iodine in it. So you literally just shove a radiation detector coupled to diagnostic imaging software, and that's what the medical field does. They're PET scanners. They used to have gamma cameras, were the old style, but they're PET scanners. All of that sort of stuff. What they scan you with in nuclear medicine is, so it's not just PET anymore, but yeah, they shove you under a gamma camera and they take these images. So it is possible. At the end of the day, for most of the long-lived isotopes you'll encounter in industries, is generally a urine collection, and then you send it off to a lab and they'll assess uranium or thorium and stuff in it.
Send it off to a lab in lead-lined casing, perhaps?
Generally not. No, not needed.
Oh,
I mean, when you're talking norm, I mean, nuclear medicine, yes, where they actually inject people with radioactive dyes to get these images. Yes, there are rules in place where nuclear medicine patients, and I'm sure people in the audience have known someone who's had some nuclear medicine. 50% of Australians will get it in our lifetime. That they have been told to keep their urine and feces separate and not to dispose of it for a certain amount of time, or they're kept in the hospital and they have to put their body function fluids into a container before it can be disposed of. And that's the delay and decay trick that we talked about on one of the slides, was that if you it's such a short half-life, the order of days or hours generally for technetium-99, and you just keep it for a couple of days, and then you can dispose of it through the sewage stream. But yeah, they are ones where they will put it in a pot. They'll put it in a lead pot and keep it because it's that hot. If you're talking norm, naturally occurring radioactive materials, there's nothing that exists in nature that's that hot. Yeah, you can go to extreme examples in nature, but there's nothing that anybody's going to encounter that's that hot. There was one, when I say not that hot, I mean there was one a few million years ago or something. There was a natural reactor that occurred in Occupational in Africa. There's actually a uranium deposit in the ground went critical by itself under natural processes. So there's actually artificial, what we call artificial radionuclides, cobalt-60, cesium-137 and stuff like that, that it occurs at this uranium deposit because it underwent natural criticality. But you just don't find it in, that you don't find stuff that's that hot in nature. or even in stock standard industrial processes, all of the norm that people are going to be dealing with. It's going to be low level. It's going to be in that 1 to 20 millisievert a year range.
That's fascinating. And I think Bori Rose just added a little extra comment about that last question, that in vivo and in vitro bioassay for internally deposited nuclides is a long time, well-established, defined method. That's for
Exactly.
determining what's being exposed
Yep.
to.
And
Thanks, Bori.
then we end up going back. You go back to the ICRP tables of so you can back calculate the dose associated. You take the urine sample, you get the lab result, and then the radiation specialists can back calculate the dose that's associated with that.
Right. Like determine the age of the dinosaurs,
Yep.
etc. Oh, that was excellent. I mean, I think I could probably go on for another hour of Cameron asking you questions, but I think we are getting close to the time. Sorry about the start time, everybody. We thought it was to start on the hour, but it looks like there was some discrepancy with the flyer, so we started just a wee bit early. So we'll be coming to the end of our hour and a half now. So thank you so much for all the comments. I see some questions about the recording. Yes, it will be uploaded, and I believe you will be sent out information for the link to that. Thank you so much, Cameron. You've been very generous with your time and your knowledge. I think I've gained more knowledge in the last hour and a half with this session than I have in about 20 years of hygiene. So thank you so much for that. And I hope everybody else feels at least encouraged and maybe finds the topic a little bit less mystifying. I think we should be paying more attention to it, just in virtue of the fact that we are potentially surrounded by some materials that are radioactive, and we should delve into it. And yeah, so thank you again. Thank you. Everything will be recorded. You've got continuing maintenance points. I think, unless anybody else has anything to say, I just want to close up by saying thank you on behalf of IOHA for joining us today and your participation. And like I said, please feel free to join. It's a wonderful, welcoming group. We hope to see you in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cameron. Cheers.